My name is Omar Rubalcava, and the paper I chose to research is Ending Global Poverty and Why Money Isn't Enough. This paper is written by Lucy Page and Rahini Pandey, and this paper emphasizes the complexity of global poverty and how many different tools are needed to help end poverty by focus on, first, economic growth, education, private aid, as well as government aid, and long-term sustainability. I just want to start out with a statistic I found from an outside source. In 2022, a total of 712 million people globally were living in poverty, and that was an increase of over 23 million people compared to 2019. And the reason I find this so compelling is it's a very common misconception that money alone will solve poverty, and as this world gets richer and richer, we think that we're going to slowly get rid of poverty, but as you can see here, we are actually, the amount of people in poverty continues to grow. And money can help reduce poverty initially. That's always going to be a truth, but it cannot provide invisible infrastructure, and it's never going to be sustainable. Also, economic growth may initially help, but it can also lead to further poverty gaps in middle-income countries. So from countries going to low-income countries to middle-income countries, although they have economic growth, they can still the gap in the poverty line can grow even further. In India, the top 10% of incomes is captured by 66% of growth between 1980 and 2016, while the bottom 50% is captured only by 11%. So you can see there that a lot of although there's been growth in India, only 10% of the incomes is captured by over half of the country. A little overview of this paper. This paper emphasizes the complexity of global poverty and what we need to do to end it. And things I'm going to be focusing on from this paper are what poverty is, and want to answer that question because it's a very complex thing in this world and it has very many different definitions. As well as going to focus on invisible infrastructure and what it is and what we need to do with it. Then I'm going to go into private aid versus state-funded aid, and then also problems of capacity and problems of will in these countries in poverty. Some of the data I used in this paper come from the Rockefeller Foundation's anti-hookworm campaign in Madra's presidency. Some of the samples were hookworm infections in the US, Colombia, as well as India, then from state-led school systems, school teachers, and community leaders. And some of the demographics of those come from the state, education boards, and then also based on geography. Go ahead and start with poverty. Now, what is poverty? Like I said, poverty has many different definitions depending on where you get the information from, and I just picked 4 of my favorite that I feel cover each end of poverty as much as we can. So beginning with, most dictionaries simply define poverty as inferior quality or even just an insufficient amount. The World Health Organization defines poverty as when an individual or household income is below what is needed for sustenance. And to get further into that, the World Bank identifies extreme poverty when per capita income is below the international poverty line, which is currently set at $1.90 a day. And then finally, the one that I feel like covers every aspect of poverty, the United Nations came out and said that it is a condition characterized by severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education and information, and it depends not only on income, but also the access to services to help in your daily life. And some of the trends I found in poverty from this paper, there has been an increase in the amount of poverty in middle income countries. So we're not seeing poverty only in low income countries, we're also seeing it in these middle income countries as well. And this shows that money and economic growth are not enough to end poverty. And like I said earlier, Growth may lift many people out of poverty, but it also has led to an increasing amount of inequality. And in 1987, 90% of the world's poor lived in low-income countries, while only 6.5% lived in middle-income countries. And only 5 of the 20 countries with the most people in poverty were middle-income countries. And by 2013, over 60% of the world's poor lived in middle-income countries, not low-income countries like many of us would believe. And 9 of the 20 countries with the highest concentration of extreme poverty were actually middle-income countries. Again, we're finding this in these middle-income countries rather than low-income countries like many of us have thought prior to this. And here in this graph, it shows kind of where we're going from 1987 to 2013. And as you can see, there was a lot of these low-income countries started out as low income in 1987, and then by 2013, a lot of them go into these middle-income countries. But if you compare the difference in the amount of people in extreme poverty, in these middle-income countries, we see 478 million people in 2013, whereas only 284 million of those people in the world today are in low-income countries. So again, we're seeing nearly double of the amount of people in poverty in middle-income countries rather than low-income countries. Now, back in 1987, that's not the case at all. It was all low-income for the most part. So over 1.5 million people in poverty were in low-income countries, and only 115 million were in middle-income countries. So we're seeing this trend of poverty going from not only low-income countries, but almost more so in these middle-income countries. Go ahead and go into invisible infrastructure. So what is invisible infrastructure? A simple definition would be the social and human systems that enable citizens to realize their capabilities and escape poverty. Now, invisible infrastructure is vital to ensuring low-income countries stay out of poverty as they grow richer. And that's because, of course, they begin to receive less aid. Enabling the provision of invisible infrastructure requires building capable and accountable domestic states. Invisible human and social infrastructure is critical for enabling the poor to realize their capabilities for economic mobility. So this can help people, again, money alone won't help people get out of poverty, but invisible infrastructure is the tools that we need to give these people, along with the money, to be able to grow themselves and grow out of poverty sustainably and long term. So a couple of examples of invisible infrastructure are healthcare, education, and then incentive and information structures. So again, we can give people all the money we want, but without healthcare, they won't live as long, they won't be able to work, so they can't have no sustainable economic growth. And that goes along with education. People with better education can get better jobs, and the economy can grow stronger and stronger. Again, sustainably, that's the big difference here. And then things even simple as incentive and information structures, just helping people realize what is important. Now, and in the US, that may seem pretty obvious for a lot of things that we do in our day-to-day lives, but people who lived in third world countries their entire lives, very simple things may go over their heads. And these simple incentive and information systems can really help people not be healthier, but they can also realize the importance of education and growing out of poverty rather than just relying on money. So let's next go into private aid versus state-funded aid. So I'm going to go over a couple of pros and cons of both of these. A couple pros of private aid are it avoids a lot of the corruption that state-funded aid is sustained to. It also can provide better quality education because a lot of these private funded aid systems really like to put a strong emphasis on education, and they're also better for providing invisible infrastructure. So again, a lot of these private funded aids, they know the importance of education and invisible infrastructure, so they like to put a strong emphasis on both of those. Now, some of the cons are a lot of the times, no matter how much money these private funded systems how much money they can fund, a lot of times they'll still need the state to help them work into these smaller, villages and rural areas because only money can only take them so far, so they need the state to cooperate with them. And in some cases, they still do require some state funding, which it's inevitable sometimes that they don't have enough money, but with the help of the state funding, they can help a lot better. And then going to foreign aid, we are actually seeing a strong increase in the amount of foreign aid, and it has grown between 1960 and 2016. It went from 32 billion to 158 billion, so we're seeing it grow nearly 5 times as much. And foreign aid is also responsible for large programs such as global health and aid-funded campaigns such as the one against smallpox. These programs are usually done through vertical programs, which are campaigns that target a particular need and is funded by an overseeing external donors. Now, there is still some cons to this as well, and what I chose to use for a con here is just a simple statistic that I found, or a quote rather, is if the cost of ending poverty were simply a dollar value, the shortfall between the poor's daily consumption, which is $1.90, then the program would appear to have been solved. Official development assistance has exceeded this value since 2006. So like I said, money is never going to be enough, right? That's kind of the whole point of this paper. And if it was enough, the amount of money that's been spent on foreign aid would have solved global poverty completely almost 20 years ago now. So we've far exceeded that dollar amount, which some experts believe there is one, that we've far exceeded it by over 20 years. So that kind of proves that money is never going to solve global poverty on its own. And then here's another graph to show kind of the growth we're seeing in foreign aid. So you see in 1980, there's still a lot, but right around 2000, we see a large spike up into 2016, where we're at that $158 billion mark. And a lot of it's coming from governments, and then some of it's debt related, and then budget support, as well as social, humanitarian, and economic funding. So we're starting to see this growth, which is also helping in some aspects of getting people the invisible infrastructure that they need to help grow out of poverty. And one of the examples that I found of a private funded program was the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission. Now, this did really good in the US and Colombia. It was established for the eradication of hookworm disease in 1910 due to widespread hookworm infections across the southern United States. And again, the campaign achieved large and long-lasting reductions in hookworm infection rates in the US and Colombia. And this led to increases in school attendance, literacy, and returns to education among children. So going back into a little bit of invisible infrastructure there and focusing on education. And in India, the campaign made short-term progress by dispensing medications, although it could not reduce hookworm infection rates without large-scale improvements in domestic sanitation systems. So this kind of shows the importance of invisible infrastructure once again. It's the same amount of money was spent, but in countries where we had strong invisible infrastructure, the program did amazing and nearly eradicated hookworm disease altogether. Whereas in India, where they didn't have a strong invisible infrastructure, it only made short-term progress. So problems of capacity and problems of will. Some of the problems of capacity is many countries do not have the money to run programs for the poor and lack the physical capacity to collect and spend resources at the scale needed to provide these services. And this can be high poverty, middle income countries tend to have also a low tax capacity. So that's where we're kind of seeing this problems of capacity, and they can't raise the money through taxes. And then states who can raise the funds for invisible infrastructure still face the danger of corruption, making it difficult for the funds to reach the poor. And a significant share of the resources in that high poverty, middle income countries earmarked for responsible protection may not reach the right beneficiaries. Then problems of will. So even for the countries that can gather the money, the invisible infrastructure may still be too poor, and they still lack and they also may just lack the will to do so. They just don't want to do it, or they're they're not putting enough emphasis on it. And the lack of will can be found expression in spending resources on projects that may seem unnecessary given the high rate of poverty, and that can only be justified through complex trickle-down reasoning. Problems of will on the part of government become problems of agency on the part of poor as well. So where the government doesn't have the will, it's not gonna, the people in poverty also will not have the will to grow. And so the contribution that I think this paper made was it compiled years of research and studies from many different authors in different countries. Like I said, poverty is very complex, so gathering all this information into one really helps explain the importance of poverty. Gathering the abundance of research found in this paper gives the world a better understanding of the complexity of poverty as well. And although it does not solve poverty, this paper educates us on the importance of non-monetary tools such as invisible infrastructure that must be used to fight poverty. Some of the results were economic growth has led to large reductions in poverty over recent decades, and further reductions will also require providing the invisible infrastructure that the poor need. This provision can rely in part on aid and private players, but it will need to work on principally through the domestic state. And recently, development economics has seen the emergence of experimental literature and that evaluates microeconomic policies individually, and this has led to a discussion on the relationship between single program evaluations and system level change. So some of the mechanisms the author used was poverty is very hard to understand, right? And it is not solved by simply giving people money. And this paper does a good job of exploiting this by giving examples of countries that went from low-income countries to middle-income countries like we see in that graph, and they still have a high rate of poverty. The author also stresses the fact that many things are needed to end poverty and they all must work in unison. Money alone will never solve global poverty. In conclusion, the result of this paper is very interesting. I think the author compiled an enormous amount of evidence that shows that money cannot solve poverty, contrary to a very common belief that it can. The end of this paper states that we will live in a much richer world by 2030. This does not mean we will be free of poverty, and the author stresses that it is in the hands of the people. I learned how many complex tools are needed to fight poverty and why they are not important, or why they are important. I now know why money will not be enough to solve poverty. Instead, we must all come together to end poverty together with the tools needed. And then here's some just the data used outside of the paper alone. And that is all.